Howdy, everybody. So we left off last time we were talking about JFK and kind of the Cold War. Now we're going to kind of pivot. We'll go back in time just a touch to kind of pick up where civil rights started right after World War II. Bring it up to JFK and then talk about civil rights all through Kennedy's term. So this is going to be the big thing. So we've been talking about the Cold War, but it's going to be civil rights that's really going to kind of derail Kennedy's Cold War efforts, because it's hard to say we're better than Russia when you have black people being attacked by dogs on the news and the whole world gets to see this. So Kennedy's going to have to do something about it. He's reluctant. It's not what he wants to focus on, but he's going to have to do it. But before we jump into Kennedy's take on civil rights, we're going to go back in time to the end of World War II, talk about why many of these minorities coming back after the war are thinking they deserve more. Not only do they want more, but now they're thinking they deserve it. They've earned it by their contribution to World War II. So we talked about this during the World War II lectures a little bit. So Mexican Americans served in massive numbers. 350,000 Mexican Americans served. So that's out of 1.4 million in the whole country. So this is a big percentage. 17 were awarded the Congressional Medals of Honor. So they served in mixed units, all this kind of stuff. We talked about Native Americans. We talked about the Navajo and Joe Medicine Crow. We talked about the Nisei troops with Asian and Japanese American troops. We talked about African American troops serving in large numbers as well. About 500,000 African Americans from across the United States served in different branches of the U.S. Armed Forces. These units these troops were put in segregated units. And pretty much everything about their life was segregated, despite the valorous service they did. Remember, we talked about Dory Miller, who, despite serving valiantly, despite defending his ship at Pearl Harbor, he is only promoted to third-class cook because the Navy would only let African Americans be cooks at this point in time. Only one Black Army regiment saw significant combat, the 92nd Infantry Division in Italy. When questioned about this, why were African Americans not at the front lines fighting? The Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, claimed that, quote, Negroes have been unable to master efficiently the techniques of modern weapons. Now, there's going to be one example that wholeheartedly disproves this. This is going to be the Tuskegee Airmen, who were using the most advanced technology at the time, the fighter pilots, the fighter planes, and they're going to become one of the most proficient, if not the most proficient, fighter squadron in the entire World War II, at least in the European theater. They're going to shoot down scores of Nazi fighters, and they proved to be one of the best out there. So much so that white crews flying bombers request the Tuskegee Airmen. So this is a special thing. They've kind of earned their place, and they're proving that a lot of the racist rhetoric is just that. It's just racism. It's not founded in any reality. Now, this is what starts the kind of double V campaign. So victory abroad and victory at home. So let's send our soldiers, our men, so African Americans, Mexican Americans, all these groups, let's go over and fight for the nation, but let's also fight for civil rights at home. So let's also fight for civil rights at home. So on top of everything else, Nazism helps discredit racism. It's hard to say you believe in the same ideas as the Nazis when they are your country's sworn enemy. And it's hard to say things the Nazis said after the war, because people are going to say, well, it sounds like you're talking like a Nazi. And Nazis are, in American mind at this point, kind of the worst thing you could be. So if you want to say racist things, it's going to sound a lot worse than it did just a decade earlier before the war. You add in the Holocaust and all these other extremities, it's very difficult to make these kind of statements that have any connection to Nazi ideology. Truman is going to take it a step further. He creates a council asking what can be done about segregation, what can be done to help improve it. Well, news came back, all his reports said, best choice is to most likely integrate the military. It's a controlled, safe environment. The president has absolute control, doesn't need congressional approval to do it. So he integrates the military. So shortly after World War II, we get our first fully integrated military. Now, it's not just the government that's trying to integrate. America's favorite pastime, baseball, is beginning to integrate. So there's newspaper talking about Truman's integration, but you're going to have Jackie Robinson that's going to break the color barrier in baseball. On April 15th, 1947, Jackie Robinson trotted out onto the field of the Brooklyn Dodgers Ebbets Field, breaking the color barrier for the first time. Now, the manager of the Dodgers, Branch Rickey, was looking for a ball player to break the color barrier. But not only that, he wanted the best ball players, which just happened to be, in this case, a black man. So he selected Jackie Robinson, the 27-year-old sharecropper who's the grandson of slaves. Now, he met with Robinson and made it clear that it's going to be a hard thing for Robinson to do this, to break this color barrier. He's going to get a lot of attacks. He's going to get slurs. He's not going to, be loved instantly in what is a white-dominated sport at this, or white-only sport at this point in time. Now, Jackie Robinson's not thrilled with this. He says, "Don't you want a ball player who's not afraid to fight back?" But Branch Rickey replies, "I want a ball player brave enough not to fight back." Because he said, if you fight back, if you live up to what they expect you to be, it's going to bar African Americans from the major leagues for years. They said you're going to have to prove them wrong, not by lashing out and defending yourself, but by being the undeniably best player in the league. And that's exactly what he did. And to his word, enduring everything horrible that they could throw at him, segregated hotels, discriminatory slurs, death threats, warnings, attacks on his family, all these kinds of things he endured. And it's going to be his success on the baseball field that will win him legions of fans and catch the public's fancy. And by the end of the year, Robinson had led the Dodgers to the National League pennant and had won the Rookie of the Year award. So he overcame many of the racial kind of barriers and opened the door for other African Americans and other minority groups to enter into the major leagues. Now, after World War II, other veterans are starting to fight for their rights. So you have a guy named Hector P. Garcia, and he's going to help set up the American GI Forum. So this is kind of pushing for Mexican American civil rights in South Texas. Now, he and other organizations like the NAACP are going to start mobilizing. And the GI Forum's first big case is going to deal with this man, Felix Longoria. Now, he's a Mexican-American veteran that was killed in the Philippines during World War II. 3 years after the war, his remains were finally returned to his family. And they were denied funeral services by a white funeral owner. He just wouldn't hold the funeral for them because he was a Mexican or Mexican American. Lyndon Baines Johnson, a senator from Texas and eventually vice president, steps in and helps, and he secures Longoria's burial at Arlington National Cemetery near the Capitol. And this case brought national recognition to the American GI Forum and Mexican American civil rights altogether. Now you have other issues with Mexican American civil rights. You have something called Operation Wetback, which deported after World War II vast numbers of who were supposed to be only Mexicans, but caught up many Mexican Americans as well. So this is going to be a problem because it deported anyone who was considered an illegal immigrant without any possibility of defending their citizenship. So you actually have American citizens that just because they looked Mexican were deported to Mexico even though they were US citizens. So we have some serious civil rights setbacks immediately after World War II. Now the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, is going to choose a strategy based on legal court cases. Break down the laws, then you can have real societal change. So they're going to use Texas, kind of the center of many egregious civil rights violations. They're going to use it as a testing ground for many court cases. So the first of these major court cases is Smith v. Allwright in 1944. Now, a few years earlier, in 1923, Texas had passed a law that said blacks could not participate in the Democratic primary, period. They claimed the Democratic Party was kind of a private club, and it could bar whoever it wanted from participating. Now, the problem with this is if you can't vote in the Democratic primary in Texas, you can't vote who's going to be the Democratic candidate. And the problem with that is, in Texas, as much across Deep South, the Democrats are pretty much the only party that were winning. So if you couldn't vote for who was going to run for the Democratic Party, it wasn't much of a vote anyways, because the Democrats were probably already going to win. So if you didn't vote in the primary, the general election vote wasn't going to matter too much. So in 1944, the case of Smith v. Allwright came before the Supreme Court. Lonnie E. Smith, a black voter from Harris County, Texas, where Houston is, sued the Texas Democratic Party because they would not allow him to vote in the Democratic primary. Now, this matters like what we just said, because if he couldn't vote in the primary, he could not really have a dramatic impact on the final election. And the effort to deny blacks their right to vote was pretty egregious in places like Texas. And the Supreme Court decision was 8-1 to strike down the all-white primary. Now, this case only applied to Texas, although it affected other white states who also had all-white primaries. So political rights were important, but the main target of the NAACP was striking down the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson, which was created in 1896. Now, this has been used to justify segregation in all aspects of life, but most focused on education. So the segregation of schools was probably the worst aspect of the segregation policies. Now, attacking elementary and high school segregation was going to be a really big task. So the NAACP set their targets on college segregation. If we can integrate colleges, that's one step closer towards all schools. So they reach out to Heman Sweat, and they're going to use him as kind of a test case that'll result in Sweat v. Painter. So they asked Heman Sweat, a postal worker in Houston, to apply to the UT Law School, knowing full well that he would be rejected because he was black. Now, he was perfectly qualified. There was nothing barring him from going to the school other than the school's policy of not allowing blacks in. Now, UT realized by denying him access, they were breaking the law, because either you have to let African Americans into the school, or you have to create a separate but equal institution. So UT very quickly set up a basement law school where he was in a basement with a bunch of law books and said, well, that's equal. It's separate and it's equal, but it's really not. And that's where the case lies. So the NAACP appealed to the Supreme Court in 1949. And in Sweat v. Painter, the U.S. Supreme Court decided in 1950 that Texas had indeed failed to provide equal facilities. And the reason is pretty apparent. And the idea behind all this, if you go to two different schools, you're getting two different experiences. So going to UT versus going to Yale is going to get you two different types of law degrees. And the idea is that going to UT law versus going to their basement law is going to provide two different educations. So lawyers, like many of the lawyers on the Supreme Court, these judges that have been to law school, understood this separation, understood this difference. And they said, higher education can no longer separate. No segregation in colleges and universities. Now, this hasn't quite broken down Brown versus Board of Education, but it's one step closer. And by 1958, approximately 2/3 of all colleges and universities in Texas had integrated their classes. Ironically, it would turn out to be harder to integrate by sex, by gender, than by race. Getting women into schools, higher education, was often more difficult than getting African Americans in. Now, let's talk about Brown versus Board of Education. This is the true case that's really going to tear down the separate but equal policies. Now, this court case is going to take place in 1954. Now, a black man in Topeka, Kansas, named Oliver Brown, sued the school board, arguing that his 8-year-old daughter should not have to be forced to attend an inferior Negro school miles away from her home, when there was a perfectly good white school just 3 blocks. So why did she have to be bused across town when just down the street there was a perfectly good white school? And the lawsuit reached the Supreme Court in 1953, and in 1954 the Supreme Court will issue a unanimous and stunning ruling that they were overturning separate but equal. Now, the court maintained that even if schools where blacks were equal in every respect, the fact that they were separated at all was creating an inequality of experience. By forcibly segregating students, the experience was changing, and therefore it could never be equal. And their decision was, in the doctrine, in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. So this is a huge step forward. And moreover, this was a unanimous decision. Now, in order to achieve this unanimous decision, they didn't say what had to be done. They left that for a second court case, Brown versus Board 2, which was issued in 1955. And it ordered all schools in the United States to integrate with all deliberate speed. Now, that's kind of a wiggle word, because African Americans might see all deliberate speed as tomorrow. We need to integrate immediately. While many white Americans saw this as, well, we'll get to it one day. We will get around to it when we feel like it's good and safe and makes sense. So all deliberate speed is going to be a problematic term. Now, for African Americans, most African Americans supported integration, were optimistic about the opportunities this would provide for their children, and in general, they were happy. But they were also scared of what this might mean for that first generation of children to have to go into these schools and actually oversee and do the process of integration, and how their children would be treated in many of these white schools. White families were terrified of integration, and the vast majority opposed it, primarily because they thought this meant the loss of privileges for their children, the advantage their children experienced over African Americans. Now, Southern schools are going to experience the biggest opposition in Southern states. One of the most protracted was in Virginia, where the state's politician called for, quote, massive resistance to the Brown decision. And in order to prevent integration, Virginia decided to shut down their schools rather than integrate them. So they said, if it means black and white kids going to school together, we're just not going to have school at all. So white Virginians had decided they would rather not educate white children if it meant having to educate black children alongside them. So things are getting really bad. Now, this is when things are going to begin getting worse. This is going to be the case of Emmett Till. I have a video in Blackboard that I highly recommend watching, so make sure you double check that and watch that short video. So in the immediate aftermath of the Brown decision, confrontations and racial violence erupted across the nation. Brown was a culminating moment for the civil rights movement, and it marked a shift. Before Brown, the civil rights movement was primarily a legal movement, trying to break down and erode legal precedents to kind of justify and give support to the African American and minority communities to ask for their changes. But with the Brown versus Board of Education decision, they've broken down virtually all the barriers. Now you actually have to change things. And it's when change is starting, when you start getting the backlash against that change. So in the summer of 1954, a black Chicago teenager named Emmett Till, only 14 years old, was visiting family in Mississippi. He went out to a store one day and he never returned. His badly beaten body was later found in a river, horribly beaten and disfigured. His eyes had been gouged out. He'd been shot through the head. His body had been weighed down in the river with a 70-pound cotton gin fan tied around his neck with barbed wire. Till had been lynched. His body was returned to Chicago, where it was put on public display. His mother insisted an open casket funeral despite the disfigurement, because she wanted the world to see what had been done to her son. Tens of thousands showed up to attend his funeral, and images of his mutilated body were reproduced in newspapers across the nation. The two men accused of the crime were acquitted of all wrongdoing. The all-white jury took less than an hour to find them innocent. One of the jurors said, quote, if we hadn't stopped to drink a pop, talking about soda, it wouldn't have taken so long, meaning they were going to find them innocent regardless of any evidence that they had actually committed the crime. What was even more shocking is after their acquittal, after they had been found innocent, they admitted to their crime. They said, yeah, we did it. Now, the whole reason they claimed they did it was because Emmett Till had catcalled one of their wives, had whistled at one of their wives, or made some other comment. Now, on her deathbed, she recanted that statement, saying, I didn't hear anything. I didn't do that. I didn't say that. I never saw him do it. That was just an excuse that was used. Now, the openness of the brutality is going to shock America. And this is where we're going to start seeing a more ardent push in the civil rights movement. Now, what's crazy is what year did lynching finally become a federal crime? When did it escalate from just being murder to being something even more sinister than normal murder? Murder with this kind of nefarious racist intent. So this court case, or the Emmett Till case, was in the 1950s. So when would it make sense? 2020. So just this year was when lynching became a federal crime. So you can see how slow civil rights is still moving, even today in many ways. Now elsewhere, you have people like Rosa Parks beginning to protest segregation on the bus lines. When asked to give up her seat on the bus to a white man, she refuses, and they call police and have her arrested. And this is going to begin what's known as Montgomery bus boycotts, where the African American community boycotts riding on the buses altogether. African Americans begin carpooling. African American mechanics begin working on the cars to keep them running. Everybody works together to make sure that African Americans can get where they need to go for work and school and groceries and church and everything else, and not have to ride the bus. Now, this is going to prove something about civil rights and about racism in a larger sense. The buses are going to be effectively empty due to this boycott. This means the bus system is losing vast amounts of money because not many people are riding it. Now, what this is going to prove is that when you start hitting people in their wallets, when you start taking away their money, it's amazing how less racist people can become. All of a sudden, they're like, oh, we don't mind. It's okay. We'll share seats. They can sit wherever they want. Just please ride the buses again. And racism is a false thing. It only exists whenever there's a benefit for it. When that benefit is overwhelmed, in this case by financial burden, that benefit is ethereal. It blows away in the wind. And the boycotts work. And people are able to ride the bus, sit wherever they want, and life resumes. Now, one of the biggest results of this kind of boycott is going to be the rise to prominence of Martin Luther King Jr., MLK. Now, this is going to be kind of the first big push. However, segregationists, people that are still pushing forward these segregationist ideas, are emboldened by Eisenhower's reluctance to really do anything. Now, even President Eisenhower disagreed with the Brown decision. He said, quote, "I don't believe you can change the hearts of men with laws or decisions." He later called his appointment of Earl Warren to the Supreme Court, the man who had written the Brown decision, quote, "the biggest damned fool mistake I ever made." So he is not wanting to send any support to integrate any of these schools. And this is when we need to talk about the Brown decision in Texas. Black Texans, as you can imagine, supported integration, and about 80% of white Texans opposed any attempt to integrate our schools. Now, this can best be seen in the Texas governor's race of 1954. A guy named Alan Shivers is going to run for the presidency, and he explains to many Texans during that campaign. He says, "All my instincts, my political philosophy, my experience, and my common sense revolt against this Supreme Court decision," talking about Brown versus Board of Education and the push towards integration. Now you can see elsewhere in Texas, anti-immigration laws are going to pass in 1956. So 3 measures come up talking about anti-immigration and promoting segregation. The first law was a measure to strengthen the laws against interracial marriage. Now, interracial marriage was already illegal in Texas. This new law just made it super duper illegal. Second was a law exempting white students from attending any integrated school. So basically, if your school was integrated, white kids just didn't have to go to school at all. And third, a law authorizing a state action to block federal government's intervention for integrating Texas schools. Now, apparently, we will be able to use things like the Texas Rangers, the Texas state law enforcement, to block federal orders to integrate our schools. Texas will pass all 3 measures. Henry Gonzalez, the lone Mexican American in the state legislature at the time, filibustered against all 3, but he was ultimately unable to stop their passing. And this brings us to Mansfield High School. So right where our class is taking place. So all of this is coming to a head when Mansfield was ordered to be the first high school in Texas to desegregate. Now in 1956, Mansfield High School, south of Fort Worth and Dallas, Mansfield, Texas, was ordered to integrate. And Mansfield did not react very well. Effigies were hung at the front of the school and on light poles or flagpoles outside the school. And they bore inscriptions like, quote, "This would be a terrible way to die," and quote, "This Negro tried to enter a white school." So they're very clearly sending a message. Now, several meetings were held throughout the town by white families about what to do about the situation of integration. They decided we'll mobilize against this. If any black student tries to register for classes, we will basically intimidate them, trying to keep them from coming. And you have the formation of white mobs trying to intimidate them on the day of school registration. Some carry signs with racial slurs. Others threaten violence against African Americans. You can see on these cars many of the racial slurs that are being done. So this is not a happy time, not a time you want to send your children in to go experience this violence and threats. The NAACP went immediately into action, asking the governor and Eisenhower to step in and do something to protect these students that by federal law should have a right to go to school at Mansfield High School. Well, the governor, Alan Shivers, does respond. He does send in the Texas Rangers. And he told them to do 2 things. Arrest anyone whose actions appeared likely to disturb the peace, and 2, to transfer out of the school any student whose presence or attempts to register were likely to cause violence. Now, which students are going to cause a disturbance of the peace and their presence are likely going to cause violence? African Americans. So he's telling the Texas Rangers to use their force, to use their ability as a legal and law enforcement agency to prevent integration, to prevent black students from going to school. What's worse is these Rangers do their job And Eisenhower does not step in, does not intervene. So the government is not doing what it's supposed to. Now there's another governmental program called COINTELPRO. This is Counterintelligence Program. This is an FBI program used to spy on dissenting citizens within the United States. So it's a spy program against American citizens. And they targeted any groups or individuals that were deemed subversive, such as feminist organizations, the Communist Party in the United States, anti-Vietnam War organizers, civil rights activists like the Black Panther movement or Martin Luther King or Malcolm X, the American Indian movement, anyone that supported environmental or animal rights or independence movements like Puerto Rico, and other groups like the KKK, which were deservedly being targeted, but a whole bunch of the civil rights organizations were being targeted as well. Now, Mansfield failed to receive any federal support. It's going to be when we get to Little Rock, Arkansas, another school in September of 1957, another high school, that 9 Black students were supposed to go and integrate, were supposed to attend this school. This is going to have a very different outcome for very particular reasons. So when these students tried to go to school, people were yelling things at them like 2, 4, 6, 8, we ain't going to integrate and go back to the jungle. So can you imagine a high school student having to endure all these attacks and slurs? And you're going to have a state openly defying this. The state will mobilize their state National Guard using national troops to bar students from going to school. Now, Eisenhower could not let this stand. In Mansfield, it was the Texas Rangers, it was state level stuff being done. But here, it's the National Guard being mobilized. Eisenhower can't let that stand. So he mobilizes 1,000 federal troops, sends them down to Arkansas, and nationalizes 10,000 of the Arkansas National Guard members. And he's going to use these 11,000 troops to make these 9 students to be able to go to school. Now, Eisenhower thus becomes the first president since Reconstruction to use federal troops to enforce the rights of Blacks. So this is a big step forward. But keep in mind, it took 11,000 federalized troops to get 9 Black students to go to high school. This is wild. Other peaceful protests across the nation are beginning to take place, trying to push the line even further for civil rights. You have sit-ins beginning at lunch counters, like the Montgomery Ward lunch counters. So this is basically like you would go in, grab a sandwich, a milkshake, all these kinds of things, but they wouldn't serve African Americans in many of these shops. People would sit in protest. African American students and white students aiding in protests would sit, many of them getting arrested for disturbing the peace, even though it's the people challenging them that are disturbing the peace. You have organizations being founded called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC, or SNCC for short. By the end of 1960, more than 50,000 people had participated in sit-ins all across the South. 3,600 of them had been arrested and jailed, usually for disturbing the peace. Others are going to try to desegregate the South in other ways. So you have the Freedom Riders. So this group of people is going to be a group of Black and white civil rights activists riding a bus all across the Upper South and into the Lower South, basically forcibly desegregating bus stops and the bus lines all across the South. So in May of 1961, 13 Freedom Riders, 7 Black and 6 white, left Washington, D.C. on a Greyhound bus headed for New Orleans. Everywhere along the way, when there was a white-only or colored-only sign, they would forcibly switch and integrate each of these stations. In the Upper South, they got dirty looks and snide comments, but no real opposition. Trouble erupted whenever they rolled into Alabama. In Anniston, Alabama, their bus was attacked by a white mob that slashed their tires and then firebombed it. It turned out the local police sergeant in Anniston had helped organize the mob. As the bus burned, the mob tried to bar the door and trap the people inside the burning bus. When the 13 Freedom Riders managed to stagger off the bus, choking on smoke, they were met with violent beatings by the white mob, brandishing baseball bats and clubs. One rider suffered so many blows to the head he had permanent brain damage. Another was taken to a nearby hospital, but it refused to treat him because of his involvement in the Freedom Rides. They were then arrested, and another nearby hospital tried and refused to treat him as well. They were then arrested and jailed in Birmingham, Alabama. And as the Freedom Riders continued, they were met by another white mob in Montgomery, Alabama, again armed with bats and iron pipes. It was, however, ironically, the white Freedom Riders that got the worst of these beatings, because many of the angry whites felt that whites should know better, that they were betraying their race by siding with African Americans for their civil rights. Now, as all of this stuff explodes, as racism and these violent scenes are being portrayed on the news nightly, this is not what Kennedy wants. This is not what he needs in the times of the Cold War, making the United States look bad. And all of this is a fundamental problem for Kennedy. So he's going to be forced to send federal troops to defend the civil rights and the Freedom Riders, having to escort the buses through the South. Now, elsewhere, you have Cesar Chavez fighting for Mexican-American civil rights, particularly for farm workers in places like California, trying to kind of earn civil rights for Mexican-Americans in many ways. And he's going to undertake what are known as kind of spiritual fasts, basically going on these long endured fasts as a way to bring attention to the plight of Mexican-American farm workers. Now again, in the fall of 1962, a federal court ordered the admission of James Meredith, a black Air Force veteran, to be admitted to the all-white University of Mississippi, Ole Miss. Now, the governor of Mississippi led the opposition, a guy named Ross Barnett. Now, to give you a sense of how virulently racist Barnett was, he once said, quote, "God made the Negro different to punish him." Barnett had kept a previous black applicant from entering Ole Miss by having him committed to a mental institution. Now, Barnett warned that Mississippi would ignore all federal rulings or laws in order to keep segregation in place. And just like Eisenhower, Kennedy is going to have to dispatch several hundred federal marshals to Ole Miss to help Meredith go to school. They were met with a mob that was well armed and amounted to about 2,000. Now, in the riot that followed, 2 people were killed and hundreds would be injured. Kennedy then, like Eisenhower, was forced to send in federal troops. About 23,000 soldiers had to be present to ensure that Meredith could go to school unopposed. Think about this. 9 kids going to school, going to high school, took 11,000 troops. 1 man going to college took 23,000 troops. This was 5 times the student population at Ole Miss. So that means there's roughly 5 soldiers for every student. This is absolutely insane. Then we go to Birmingham. And events are going to come to a head in 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama. This is a city that MLK called the most segregated city in America. So in April of '63, thousands of black demonstrators marched downtown to picket Birmingham's department stores. And they were met by Eugene Bull Connor, the city's commissioner of public safety, which is kind of an ironic title for this man. Connor will unleash hell on the protesters. He sicks attack dogs on them. They used electric cattle prods and high-pressure hoses to break up these protesters. So think about this. You have attack dogs, electric cattle prods electrocuting these people. You have fire hoses powerful enough to rip bricks from buildings being used against people of flesh and blood. Imagine what that's going to do. And what's worse is this is being shown on TV. The whole nation is watching what's being done to these African American protesters. It's one thing when Americans can kind of put racism and this out of their mind, isolate it in somewhere else. But when it's on the news every night, when you read it in the newspaper in the morning, it becomes undeniable. And this is going to force Kennedy's hand. Realizing that he can no longer straddle the issue, Kennedy was finally forced by the civil rights movement to take action. And on June 11th, 1963, Kennedy went on national television to promise major new legislation banning discrimination in public accommodations and empowering the Department of Justice to enforce desegregation throughout the states. Black leaders hailed it as a second Emancipation Proclamation. To rouse support for this proposed legislation, you have the March on Washington, culminating in MLK's famous I Have a Dream speech. Now, I Have a Dream speech linked on Blackboard, so please go look at it. Go watch that video. But there still remain massive challenges ahead that will get even more complicated as we get into 1963, 1964, 65. Things are going to get much, much worse. So bombings wreak across the South, and Kennedy is faced with some seriously hard choices. He's going to face an even bigger problem as we get into the next election. But we'll stop there for today, and we'll pick up with JFK's campaign for the next election and the rise of Lyndon Baines Johnson to the presidency. I'll see y'all guys next time.